Hello, Year 11s. So in this video today, we're going to be learning about something called thermoregulation. So we've been working on this dot point a little bit recently, specifically with homeostasis, but today we're focusing in on body temperature. And because this actually does relate to some malfunctions in homeostatic mechanisms, we'll also talk a very small amount about hyperthyroidism as well. Okay. So the question then is, why is thermoregulation important? So why do we need to maintain a core body temperature? And when we talk about a core body temperature, we don't mean the temperature of your skin or the temperature on the outside. We really mean the temperature around the organs and surrounding structures internally. And this graph here on the right shows us why this is important. So this little dotted line that I'm drawing here, this should be about, in a human, it should be 37 degrees, okay? So at 37 degrees Celsius, that is the perfect temperature for our enzymes to achieve all of their functions, so they can go about their business. So if we were to move down here in this box that I'm drawing to the left, our enzymes can still function, but because it's a little bit colder, and as we get colder and colder and colder, that efficiency will decrease, and those enzymes will become slower to work. So basically, they'll be less efficient. And then here on the right, right up until this cutoff point about here, which would be about 45 degrees, where they would become denatured and stop working. Our enzymes, when they get too hot, their function starts decreasing until it essentially ends as well. So really, what we need to maintain that 37 degrees as much as we can. Now, the interesting thing is that not all animals have the same strategy to maintain that core body temperature. So we essentially we see two strategies in the animal kingdom. We have ectotherms and endotherms. And ectotherms, you could think of ecto as sort of external. So these are animals that get their or have their thermoregulation through external factors. So in the picture here, we've got a turtle. It kind of looks like the turtle's sitting out in the sun, it's sunbathing. And that's because the turtle is using the sun to regulate its own internal body temperature. So things like reptiles, turtles, snakes, they probably won't eat very often. If you've ever had a pet reptile, you'll know that like a snake, you probably feed it once a month, I think. And that's because they're getting their thermoregulation from external factors, like maybe the heat lamp that you have set up for them or the sun. So they don't need to generate as much heat through eating. So they eat less, which is an interesting approach. And then here on the right, we have an endotherm. And this is where you can think of endo as perhaps internal, where that thermoregulation is coming from the actions or the metabolism of that animal. So we've got some wallabies in the picture here, but humans would fall into the category of endotherms as well. Let's say this wallaby would be 37 degrees Celsius on a really, really hot day, and the wallaby would also be 37 degrees Celsius on a really, really cold day, because they're regulating their own internal temperature independently of the outside environment. Okay, so now we're looking at an endotherm, and this is a human in this example. So thermoregulation is a negative feedback loop, and similar to the other negative feedback loops that you've looked at, we always start off with a stimulus. So here, the stimulus that we're looking at is a decrease in body temperature. So if our body temperature drops below that 37 degrees, we want to do something to bring it back to that baseline. So the second thing that happens is that we have our receptors, thermoreceptors. These are cells that can detect changes in temperature, and we've got them in our skin and in our organs. So our thermoreceptors will detect that decrease, and then it will send a signal off to the hypothalamus, the control center. And the hypothalamus then sends signals to effectors. And we'll have a little look at some effectors a little bit later. But essentially, these are things that can actually change that temperature. So our blood vessels in our skin in the example here, our skeletal muscles, and our brown adipose tissue. And then finally we have the responses. So our blood vessels in our skin will vasoconstrict to reduce blood flow. Our skeletal muscles will start shivering to generate heat as a byproduct. Our brown adipose tissue can produce heat as well. Okay, so in this example, we're looking at, it's still a negative feedback loop, but we're looking at an increase in body temperature rather than a decrease. For example, you might have just jumped into a hot tub, it's 40 degrees in the hot tub, or it's a 45-degree day. Your body temperature is raising above that baseline, above 37. So this is the process that might happen. So that change will be detected by the thermoreceptors, the cells that can detect temperature in your skin and your organs. That signal that they've found will get sent on to the hypothalamus, the control center. The control center will send a signal to the effectors. And in this instance, we've got the effectors we're looking at are the blood vessels in our skin and our sweat glands. And then the response will actually occur. So vasodilation, which means the vessels in our skin will get a little bit larger and we'll start sweating. Our sweat glands will open to lose heat through evaporation, and that brown adipose tissue will stop being metabolized or stop being used to help reduce the temperature. Okay, so this is just a quick look at some of the effectors that our body uses to help us regulate temperature. So here in the example on the left, we're looking at what happens when we're too cold, when we drop below 37. So we don't stop, but we try to reduce sweating. So those sweat glands will close to try and release less water, so you won't sweat quite as much. The pileoerector muscles on your hair shaft, which we can see a little picture of one here, will actually cause your hair to stand up. And you may have noticed this when you sort of get goosebumps and your skin contracts. It gets a little bit tighter when you're really cold. You'll notice that your hair stands up if you've got hair on your arms. So the reason for that is that we actually are able to trap like a small layer of warm air right beside the skin, so it acts sort of as like a bit of insulation for us. And we also have vasoconstriction. Now this says blood vessel constricting, and when you are referring to blood vessels constricting, I'd like you to use the word vasoconstriction, okay? Vaso meaning the blood vessels. So they constrict to basically pull away from the layer of the skin. So here we've got this is the air here, this area here. There's the layer of the skin here, the epidermis. And our blood vessels will get smaller, they'll constrict, and they'll move blood away from the outside of the skin to try and conserve that heat. And the other thing we do is, which I'm sure you're all very aware of, is we shiver. So what this does is we generate heat as a byproduct of all that excess shivering. Now the other example is for when we cool down. So our sweat glands will become active, they'll open, they'll release a lot of water, and as the water leaves through evaporation, as it leaves our body, it'll take some of that heat with it. These pileoerector muscles will relax, the hair will lie down on the surface of the skin, and it won't trap that little layer of warm air. And finally, our blood vessels will dilate, so vasodilation will occur. And when vasodilation occurs, they get a bit, the blood vessels get larger, so dilation means they open. And that will allow the blood closer to the skin, where it might be a little bit cooler, and where we've got that heat loss by evaporation happening. So that heat transfer from inside the body to outside the body can be sped up. Okay, and the last thing I really just very quickly wanted to touch on was a condition called hyperthyroidism. So before we talk about this, we do need to talk about a metabolic rate. And your metabolic rate is basically, you could say on a given day, that's the amount of energy that you need to use to maintain homeostasis for all the homeostatic functions. Now, in hyperthyroidism, which is, it can be a genetic condition, you can inherit it. Essentially, we have an excessive production of thyroid hormone, which increases our metabolic rate. So that means basically that we're burning more energy. So as you might expect, some of those symptoms would be like we'd have a higher resting heart rate, because we're burning more energy, we're using our heart more, we're pumping more blood around. We've got a higher body temperature, increase in appetite. You might lose weight because you're just burning off the adipose tissue or the fat tissue. You'd have a lot of trouble when it's really warm outside, and you might not notice it, and this can be quite dangerous. You might not notice when it's cold. Okay, I hope this video went well. Any questions, please ask your teachers.